with that, I'm going to share my screen. So sit tight, friends. Feel free to take notes on this, but we'll send it out as well. This one was in the email, how to write a bill presentation. Found this photo of, yeah, some grassy land and some lakes. So there you go. We brought some nature into this PowerPoint so it doesn't feel quite as dry. So yeah, writing a bill, obviously this is an important part of your job as a senator, is to represent the student body. And there's really no better way to do that than to pass legislation, right? So the three types of legislation that we have, and it can be created by any entity, any student, any faculty member within our CSU community. There's three different pieces of legislation. There's a bill, there's a resolution, and there's a lex. A bill takes specific action and or passes funding, right? So it deals with appropriations, with constitutional amendments or other legislation which can be enacted, and it has a binding effect on ASCSU operations. Often it includes money, right? So a good example is Senator Hill is trying to pass his bill to spend $15,000 on bike cameras. That is a bill because it includes money. A resolution is a stance or an opinion of the body as a whole. So we as a Senate resolve that we think that a situation needs to be addressed. Maybe it's not being handled the way it should be, or we could look at like the Graduate Student Council resolution that was passed last year, said we stand in solidarity with our graduate students, some of whom feel like they don't have the same structure to feel valued, heard, and engaged. It could be really anything relating to the university. And we've passed quite a few. I mentioned the resolution to celebrate the volleyball team, right? We could totally do that. As a body, we celebrate that they went to the NCAA tournament. So be thinking in the back of your minds of ways we can either be spending funds or we can be resolving and sharing an opinion or a stance. All of these can go to President McConnell, to Tony Frank, and to other administrators if you stipulate that in your piece of legislation. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then elects is a change it's a bill and a resolution together. Basically what it says is we want to change our governing documents, and we would need elects with 3 readings to do that. A bill and a resolution only have 2 readings. Unless, of course, you expedite. If you motion to expedite something, that means you want to pass it. You want to hear it, pass it in one night, right? Which is, it's not ideal just because it doesn't get to go through committee and you don't get to fix the minor spelling errors or add any additional clauses, but that is an option available to senators and associates. So with that, every piece of legislation must have sponsorships or endorsements. As it stands now, it has to be 3 senators or associate senators, and then 3 people with floor rights. So I mentioned floor rights, right? Anyone from the executive branch, anyone from the judicial branch, they all have floor rights. This is kind of put in place in order to build cohesion between our branches. So you could have 3 senators, 3 associates, and 3 with floor rights, or you could have 1 internal committee endorse it, right? So university affairs, budgetary affairs, internal university budgetary, you could have 1 of them endorse it, and then it would automatically be valid to be read on the floor. Or BSOF, right, the group that Alex was talking about, they can also endorse legislation. SFRB, like Schindler was talking about, they can endorse. And then the legislative cabinet, which is made up of myself, the Speaker Pro Tem, the Parliamentarian Recruitment and Retention Officer, and then all of the committee chairs, we can endorse it as well in order to get it onto the floor. And feel free to interject or ask any questions as we're going throughout. Sponsorship versus endorsement. This is actually really crucial. A sponsorship is saying, I want this to reach the floor, even if I don't agree with it, right? And that's actually a really valuable position to be able to take. You're saying, I may not agree with this legislation, but I do want it to reach the floor so that it can be heard. Whereas an endorsement says, I want this to be passed, I support this, I intend to vote for it, I intend to defend it when we have discussion and debate. So that's another consideration. You'll notice here on this bill, for example, we wrote, right, so authors were Andy Callis, myself, and then Marie Cusick. And Kyle Hill sponsored it with the intent of it reaching the floor, but wasn't specifically in favor or against it, but didn't want to see it hit the floor. In other words, hitting the floor meaning to have it read. The difference between whereas and therefore clause is very similar. You'll see on the right part of this presentation as bills that are passed at the Colorado legislature, right, or really at the national level as well. A whereas clause is just a statement of fact or clarification, right? Whereas I am sitting in an office right now, whereas I am on a Zoom call right now, right? Whereas the CSU volleyball team beat out all the other competition and they're heading to the NCAA tournament. It's stating what is happening right now, right? And then therefore means statement of intent or action. Therefore, based on that understanding, here's what we think should happen. Therefore, we should we as the Associated Students of Colorado State University stand and celebrate our volleyball team, right? We want to spend $15,000 in order to make this happen. Those are the therefore clauses, is what's going to happen because of this legislation. So you can see here, right? This was from the student privacy resolution that we passed last year, saying Colorado State University classes, they all went online March 16th. That's whereas, therefore, we stand in solidarity. And this was actually a position we did take. We thought the Proctor UN Respondus were kind of unethical because it was violating the security and the privacy of CSU students. That was a position that we took as a body, and it had almost unanimous consent, that resolution. And it's still obviously in our system. So if you're ever curious about that one, let me know. So who receives legislation? This is actually pretty important. You want this to reach Joyce McConnell, then stipulate that. Say, I want this to go to President McConnell, to Chancellor Tony Frank, and to anyone else that you think needs to be brought into the discussion or is needed in the discussion in order to make your bill resolution or lex successful, right? So you can stipulate that in the bottom. All right, I'm very proud of this. First time that we've made a graphic representation of the bill process. Might follow it up with a video if we're feeling, if we have the energy. So any member of CSU community or any of the ASCSU committees, including Women's Caucus, obviously can create legislation, right? Based on the templates that we sent out in that email, you can create legislation. It reaches its first reading, at which point it goes to budgetary, university affairs, or internal affairs. They all make their own committee edits, their changes, they add clauses, they clarify things. And then just like the federal government, we're trying to pass this in our bylaws this year to have a conference committee, which basically just makes it way more efficient to combine all of those committees' changes into one piece of legislation, one report or proposal to the Senate body. This hasn't been approved yet. So as of now, they all present separately to the Senate. But if it does pass, that's what would happen. At which point, if the body accepts the amendments, then it automatically goes into second reading, right? Discussion, debate, questions, all of that stuff. And then we would vote it up or vote it down. And then it goes to its third reading. If it were a lex, right, changing the Constitution or a governing documents, it would have to go back into the queue, back through the committees and through that process. So there it is. I know I shared this with you all, so hopefully you have access to it. Wonderful. Yeah, we got a thumbs up from Levitt. Thank you. Any questions? I'll just leave the floor open for a moment if you want to ask any questions.
Point of information. See, I did it right this time. Do you mind clarifying the difference between caucuses and committees, if there is a significant difference? Or
yeah, for sure. Thanks for clarifying. So a committee, their job is to review legislation that's read in the Senate and to present a committee report with amendments to the Senate, right? They also play an advocacy role, right? To invite community members to come and to share how they feel about certain legislation. It is open to the public, all of our committee meetings, but the role of a standing caucus is a little bit more flexible. It has a little more autonomy and agency in defining what its role is. So where I'm seeing some messages here. Yeah, so whereas it's, for the caucus, it could be the executive and it could be the legislative branch getting together. It could be community members. The role of a standing caucus is that it doesn't really have specific bylaws, and it also can't review legislation. Right, so a caucus can create legislation and it can send it to the Senate for consideration, but it doesn't receive legislation. So that's the one primary difference, I'd say. Does that answer your question?
yes, thank you.
Yeah, awesome.